All right, so we're going to get started. I know that folks are still arriving, but I wanted to say hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining us for today's virtual teach-in on Asian America, white supremacy, and the possibilities for justice. Before beginning, I would like to provide a land acknowledgement. The Tutelo Monacan people are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live. We recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Virginia Tech consumes. We pay respect to the Tutelo Monacan nations and to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Balbir K. Singh. I am Assistant Professor of Cultural Theory in the Department of Religion and Culture at Virginia Tech. I'm also core faculty in Aspect. I will be assisted by Fatima Rahman, senior undergraduate, who's one of my students in my Asian American Studies class, majoring in psychology. And today's teach-in is part of Virginia Tech's Asian Pacific Islander Desi American Heritage Month, celebrated in the month of April, sponsored by the Asian Cultural Engagement Center, the Department of Religion and Culture, the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, and the Department of History. And I owe a very, very special thanks to Dr. Nina Ha, director of the ACE Center, for all of her coordination efforts for this event and the many, many more upcoming events this month, as well as the ones that have taken place in the last 8 or 9 days at this point. Today's conversation extends the work of last year's virtual teach-in from early April on anti-Asian panic and the pandemic, as the recent acceleration of rhetoric, harm, and violence was starting to take shape amidst the beginnings of the coronavirus pandemic in the United States. What we witnessed in Atlanta just a little over 3 weeks ago, the racist, sexist, and misogynistic violence in Atlanta against Asians and Asian women, most particularly the grief and rage we feel is expanding, and with it, the festering of old historical wounds too great to name. I want to spend a bit of time framing today's conversation, and I want to do so by highlighting the brilliance and words and art of others, highlight how Asian American organizers, thinkers, artists, and cultural workers have been doing the work not only recently, but for generations. To acknowledge the work of our elders, many of whom have paved the way, but to show gratitude for their instincts, their love, and their histories. And to acknowledge that harm and violence is being done unto them most acutely, especially women and femme-identifying. I turn to the words of scholar Chad Shamura, accompanied by visuals by artist Yumi Sakugawa, to better illustrate and speak to such violence. We saw the first flickers of COVID-19 in the United States as signs of wildfires to come. We know our history of abuse, humiliation, violation. We know that we are treated as model minorities when others need to be kept down. We know we're treated as enemy aliens when that purpose runs out. We knew the violence to come was not a matter of if, but who, when, where, and how. We warned others, we clamored for help, and we were ignored, dismissed, silenced. The first of the 3 snapshots of this 10-tweet thread posted March 31st not only speaks to the anticipation of such violence against Asian Americans since the onset of the pandemic, but to the way that white supremacy has functioned to structure all such violence against us and our kinfolk. One must recognize that Asian America is born out of struggle and solidarity first and foremost. The kinds of legislative, administrative, state, and vigilante violence that faced Chinese migrants in the mid-19th century onwards, to the kinds of policies and extra-legal murders by white settler mobs against Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and South Asians into the early 20th century. These are just the beginnings of such racist antagonism, brutality, and state-sanctioned violence done in the name of white supremacist nation that is the United States. Creation of ethnic studies as a field formation marks not only the consolidation of Asian American studies, but the way that it too is always indebted to and in coalition with Black studies, Indigenous and Native studies, and Latinx studies. Make no mistake that the fallacy of white supremacy demonstrates an ongoing attempt to intimidate and harm communities of color as a way of exercising its dwindling grasp for power over the Black and brown masses in this country and around the world. Shamura writes of white supremacy thusly: The strong don't drop kick the elderly, don't gun down women who they blame for their problems, don't bomb foreign lands, don't scatter military bases around the world. The strong don't steal or enslave people. Sorry, steal land or enslave people. They don't have to go to such great lengths to succor us into serving in the army of whiteness. If they were truly powerful, then they wouldn't care what we do or who we are. Shimura rightly and importantly critiques the violence of white supremacy as ultimately a performance of power through the world shaping and foundational exploits and expansion through US imperial wars and occupations, especially in Asia and the Pacific. This performance is deadly and constantly disavowed as a part of the matrix of violence, fueled most acutely by white supremacy. One last snapshot from Shimura. Our biggest mistake would be to see ourselves through the lens of white supremacy. It's not power that white supremacists have, but violence. They cannot tolerate that we are strong, that we are powerful, that every refusal of their framework moves the world closer to the end of whiteness. They're scared and they are panicked. That's why they resort to zero-sum games, to scorched earth wars, to morally bankrupt actions, and every dirty trick they can think of in an already rigged game. Agents of white supremacy are terrified of our beauty, our creativity, our brilliance, our vision. They succeed when they make us think we're weak and they're strong. This is why I see such words as constitutive not merely of the survival and survivalist tendencies of many immigrant communities in a place like the US, but of the ways our elders, kinfolk, and our own chosen and queer affiliations with our Asian Pacific Islander folks is crucial in fostering life-affirming strategies of care, sociality, and radical relationality. To use the Indigenous studies concept of survivance too, in the midst of the remaining and final gasps of white supremacy and settler invasion, a concept that connotes an active presence and a form of active survival. It has been taken up by theorists in of political resistance to also be understood as a word that combines survival and resistance together. I will end my own framing remarks with such a concept as one deeply inspiring to me and for my Asian Pacific Islander American community, comrades, friends. I now want to pivot to introduce our four brilliant speakers who I feel so honored to have join us from both here in Blacksburg to across the nation. Unfortunately, Dr. Nicole Nee will be unable to join us today. However, this four speakers' work here and expertise spans from local government to scholar activism to national and transnational organizing. I'll read their bios in the order that they will speak. First will be Sona Shah. Sona Shah is a second-generation South Asian American born and raised in Houston, Texas. She received her undergraduate degree in Asian Studies from the University of Texas at Austin and her master's in International Development and Social Change from Clark University. Sona spent 7 years overseeing programs and administration at UT Center for Asian American Studies, the only Asian American Studies program in the South. She also taught a college-level service learning course in Asian American Studies and Social Work at UT Austin, and she is currently the Culture and Arts Education Manager at the City of Austin's Asian American Resource Center, where she oversees diverse educational and community programs. Second will be Dr. Vivian Trung. Dr. Trung is a postdoctoral fellow in Asian American Studies at Vassar College. Her current research traces the history of Asian American and multiracial movements against police violence in New York City. She coordinates a public history project preserving the archives of the grassroots organization CAAAV, Organizing Asian Communities, formerly known as the Committee Against Asian American or Anti-Asian Violence, where she formerly worked as a youth organizer and currently serves as a board member. She earned her PhD in American Culture at the University of Michigan and her bachelor's in Ethnic Studies at Brown University. Third will be Adrian Bonifacio. Adrian is the national chairperson of Anakhbayan USA, a grassroots organization of Filipino youth and students fighting for genuine liberation and democracy in the Philippines. He's also a secretariat member of the International League of People's Struggle Youth Commission, a network of anti-imperialist youth organizations in countries across the world. Our fourth and final speaker is Jessica Nguyen. Jessica is a student activist studying economics, PPE, and Asian studies. She specializes in advocacy in an institutional, local, and national context. On an institutional level, she serves as the president of the Asian American Student Union at Virginia Tech. She enjoys spending her time volunteering with the Future Economy Collective, a local nonprofit organization that facilitates mutual aid programming for the NRV area. And NRV is New River Valley for the non-locals. I have asked each of them to speak, and following their 4 respective portions, we will have some time for an open forum Q&A from our audience members. So please feel free to place questions in the Q&A box as they come up. And if you could, especially for undergraduate students, we want to prioritize questions from students. So please note that if you are a student. So we will start now with Sona, and thank you all again for attending, and I will welcome Sona here.
Thank you, Balbir. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm honored to meet the other panelists too. I'm going to just share my screen here. We can do present mode. Everyone can see that? Yeah, okay. So I do live in Austin, Texas. I'm here. I work for the City of Austin's Asian American Resource Center, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. But I really appreciate, Balbir, the way you framed the introduction, and especially knowing that in this time that many of us have been working in these communities for so long, right? And so in a lot of spaces that I've been in, especially after the shooting, has really been about how do we take care of ourselves during these times when there is this sort of collective trauma, you know, that we see everyone talking about right now. So thank you for your remarks. So I am from Texas. I think a lot of times as for Asian Americans, and especially when I would go to New York or California, people would always be surprised, right? That there was Indians that lived, or South Asians that lived in Texas. And so I show these 2 pictures just to kind of help show my trajectory into sort of this work that I do for my community. So I was born and raised in Houston, Texas, and this is a photograph of me and my sister with 2 of our American white friends, you know, down the street. And, you know, it shows a lot of sort of like cultural pride in this way that we're all, you know, getting ready for Garba and Navratri, and then like my white friends, you know, were wearing this clothes. But I was really ashamed of sort of my Indian identity growing up. I grew up in a very white neighborhood. Summer and Megan were like the family that I wanted to be. I wanted to, you know, experience what it was like eating pork chops at their house when, you know, my house, we were vegetarians. And so I show this picture, and I don't know if any of y'all have taken the Undoing Racism workshop from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, but they talk a lot about culture, right? And ways that we assimilate and how we kind of lose our culture. And so fast forward, you know, in high school and then even in college and stuff, it was really about connecting back to sort of my heritage in ways that I wanted to really, you know, back then I didn't know the term white supremacy, but when we think about it, that's what it is, right? This normative way of sort of being, this whiteness. And in what ways did I push away my parents' culture, you know, being ashamed of my mom wearing a sari at the grocery store when I was younger, right? To fast forward to me, here's me and my son at the Asian American Resource Center, actually celebrating Navratri. And my son is biracial, he's white and South Asian. I tell him all the time he's Gujarati. But to sort of instill that, right? And so in a lot of ways, the work that I feel like I've been doing previously, I was working at the Center for Asian American Studies at UT Austin, advising ethnic studies students, students of color, and really saw the impact of them learning about themselves and their histories and their identities, and knowing that we belonged in this country, because I think that's such a feeling for many of us, right? The where are you really from, all of that, that, you know, helped me kind of undo my own ways of experiencing white supremacy and reflecting on what that did. And so fast forward, or now, let me see, get to the, I was at UT for 7 years, and then I decided to apply for the City of Austin job with the Asian American Resource Center. And what's interesting is that we are really one of the few city-funded cultural centers in the United States. And what that means is, like, I don't have to fundraise. I don't have to, you know, with nonprofits and things like that, and that struggle of having to really start from the ground up in that sort of existence. And so we are in the Parks and Recreation Department, which is really interesting, and the Museums and Cultural Programs Division. My sister sites, there's the Carver Museum, which is for the African American population, the Mexican American Cultural Center too. And so it's really unique, sort of in these ways, having these cultural centers as city funded. And in many ways, like when we think about budgets for institutions, like a lot of, in a lot of conversations, we talk about these as moral documents, right? Even in universities and things, right? How much money are they putting towards ethnic studies and these other ways of really representing ourselves, right? And so, you know, when the history of the AARC, it wasn't just that the City of Austin was like, oh, let's create a center, right? There was community, same way with sort of ethnic studies in universities. And so within Austin, you know, the Asians in Austin are the fastest growing demographic group, right? Doubling roughly every 12 years. I think nationally too, we have this sort of stat. And it comprises of just 8% of the City of Austin population. But post, you know, 1965, we live in the University of Texas at Austin, right? Huge campus, where there were a lot of Asian professionals that started, you know, living here early on. And it was really this first generation of Asian Americans professionals that advocated for this space. And I'll get to more some of the challenges of sort of the intergenerational conversations, but you know, I just feel immensely privileged to be able to like work in this space and to be able to kind of do the work that I'm able to do. I've been there for 2.5 years now, and honestly, it was built as it's supposed to be sort of this multicultural kind of place. But now I really want to push it to thinking about racial equity, anti-racism, and you know, how do we discuss this stuff within our Asian American community? Because honestly, a lot of these folks in our community haven't taken an ethnic studies class, right? And so in a lot of ways, I think about the ways I bridge the kind of programming and stuff that I did at UT to the broader community. Which has definitely a lot of challenges. So this City of Austin, you know, I'm just going to read this quote here because it's really important in the ways that actually I'm able to say a lot of the things that I'm able to do. But within our City of Austin strategic direction, so this is kind of like a strategic plan for the city. It is written that to advance equitable outcomes, the City of Austin is leading with a lens of racial equity and healing. Race is the primary predictor of outcomes, and it is time to recognize, understand, and address racism at its various levels: personal, institutional, structural, and systemic. And so in the city, we actually have an equity office that is pushing these sort of conversations that was formed in 2016. And so I think I came to the city at the right time. I started in 2018, where honestly, like I could just be more vocal about how we talk about race in the same ways that y'all probably do in your college campus to the way I am in a city institution. You know, and it's really fascinating because when I first started within the Parks and Recreation Department, I found, and it's very diverse as city employees, we are very diverse. Not, I wouldn't say necessarily in leadership, but you know, in other areas, and really finding that people don't know how to talk about race, right? And so in many ways, my kind of background has, you know, really kind of helped mobilize things within our own department. And so one of the things with the Equity Office is, I really love their framework that they think about this, is that we normalize the conversation around race, around white supremacy. Like I said before about the Undoing Racism workshop, they've actually contracted with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, getting city staff to go through those Undoing Racism trainings, which can, and again, I highly recommend them. I've been to like 3 of them and I feel like it's therapy for me in these ways to kind of process my own undoing of how I've been conditioned in the world. But in the Parks and Recreation Department, we've been able to start a racial equity committee. And basically a lot of this conversation was because my director of the department was just like, I don't know how to talk about this stuff. She's a white woman, right? Never has had to process this stuff. And so, you know, we're kind of leading the way in those conversations. And then there's different things happening within different departments. When you work within a big institution, the second part of the framework is organizing. And so when we think about community organizing and stuff, and this is a lot of the ways that I think about my staff doing community work, is how do I train them to kind of think as community organizers? And so that's kind of what we do cross-departmentally. So we've really built relationships with Austin Public Health, Austin Public Library. Now we have this Asian Pacific Islander Task Force, where some of us that are very much aligned in thinking of collaboratively and thinking about institutional processes and access, language access, all those things, we meet regularly to kind of talk and organize on the ways that we do things. And then the last part of the framework is operationalizing. And so this is really like the systems work that I think sometimes, right, like in I will say, like a lot of what I felt at UT sometimes, even when we theorize so many things, right, like we forget, like, how do we actually like operationalize some of these things into what the lived experiences are of us just working, right? I will say that the challenges with this has been, a lot of this has been labor on people of color, you know, which again, it's about finding your allies, your folks that you can really just process, vent, all of this sort of stuff. And that culture change takes time, and it's generational work, right? So when we think about white supremacy culture and the organizational traits, sense of urgency is always a really big thing, right? So it's like, oh, everybody's figuring out like racism exists, right? I think this whole racial reckoning, like this past year, but for many of us people of color, we know this has been going on for a long time. And so now we're getting these directives, right? What's your equity plan? What's your, you know, all of these things that it's like, yes, there's urgency, but then there's also times to process, and how do we do this stuff with integrity? And so, you know, going back to the Asian American Resource Center in the ways that how we sort of fit into this city environment is, you know, we aren't supposed to be, as a city worker, I'm not supposed to be political, right? I'm not supposed to be advocating in certain ways. These are sort of rules that I have within. But as we know, everything we do is political, right? Like the choices I've made have been political in the sense of my own being and my own choices and what I've decided to do for my career. And so the ways that I think about doing this work is kind of like, how do I push within the systems, right? We know it's the state, right? We work within the city, we work within these structures, we work within a capitalist society, but yet we are all very complicit in these systems that we work within. And so, the work that I do, and I feel like my team, we're just trying to like really push our own understanding, our own reflections in the ways that we are doing community work without, with less harm, right? In those ways. And so here are just a couple of slides that show some of the programming that we've been doing. So as we know, with the pandemic and the rhetoric nationally, right, with the previous president and, calling it a Chinese virus, all this sort of stuff. So we helped with another organization organizing like an Asian town, like a town hall around this. This was a year ago, right, when the pandemic had started. And then there was a recent town hall too, just around the Atlanta shooting. So these conversations are happening. We're trying to find space for community members to come together to process this together. And I really see the Asian American Resource Center being a space for other Asian Americans to come together in that way, because there isn't many spaces. And we do all this virtually this past year. But this My API Live, this is really a collaboration between the other departments that I was telling y'all about, Austin Public Health and Austin Public Library. And this is through the API Task Force. One of the things we really look at are like marginalized communities here in Austin. We have a large refugee community, many, Burmese, Nepali, and in many of these ways, as city workers, we don't really quite understand these communities, right? And so we are really kind of talking with one another and finding the right advocates. And now I was actually able to hire somebody from the Burmese community who, as kind of like this outreach person, right, who kind of understands all the different languages, all the different religions, the different conflicts within the groups too, that just as Asian Americans, we don't get, right, like we don't understand. And so that's one part of the work that we're trying to do. And so this My API Live is really about giving information in their languages. So we have simultaneous interpretation in these languages. So they actually understand these resources. Because honestly, even as somebody who speaks English and stuff, going through understanding how to get a vaccine or how to do all this stuff is very complicated, right? And so we think about these ways. And we also work with specific community groups that are on the ground working in these ways. And then, we do ongoing programs. So there was this one program in January that we did, Stories from the South, and it was about archiving your own family history. And we collaborate a lot with the Austin History Center. And one of the amazing things with the Austin History Center is that they have a community archives program. And so they have actually an Asian American archivist who I love and is wonderful. We've been able to work on exhibits together to provide sort of historical exhibits in our space. So that's another collaboration we kind of do. And here are just some photographs I wanted to include about, again, we do a range of things. We have a large senior program. So one of the first programs that started at the ARC was really about thinking about isolated seniors. And we, it's really sad. That's like one of the things I miss most with our center not being open. We have like actual ping pong tables where like people just hang out and come together. And many of our elders that come there really say like this is the highlight of their week because they're just at home, right? And we actually do have a Mandarin interpreter because a majority of them are Mandarin speaking seniors. And then we also have South Asian senior population as well. And one of the things we're trying to work on is really trying to make more connections with the Vietnamese and the Korean. And so it's really thinking about how we work with immigrant communities through language access and accessibility. And then we have a community exhibits program too, where we highlight different Asian American artists throughout the year. And the picture up on the top, I guess it's my top right, I don't know how y'all are seeing it, but is we did one of the projects I worked on with the archivist at the Austin History Center was around documenting Saheli. It was one of the first South Asian organizations in the South that worked around domestic violence issues, and really the first Asian American organization here in Austin. And so it was like a 2-year project. We were doing oral histories, all these stuff, and was able to have a reception where it was like bringing together all of these folks that started this way back in the early 90s. And then different like youth programming as well. And so I'm not sure how much time I've had, but I guess one of the things I just want to say is that, you know, the challenges that I sometimes, like, I think in college campuses, it's really easy sometimes to organize some of this stuff because y'all are taking classes, you're getting, you know, this sort of information, right? And processing this stuff and finding sort of spaces. And the way that I see with us at the ARC is I want to make this stuff accessible for folks that aren't going to college, right? That aren't going to be able to take these types of courses. And so how do we sort of build this historical understanding about how we've been racialized in this country so that recent immigrants understand this, right? That our elders sort of understand this, and that how they can see that this is a bigger project of just sort of how US white supremacy permeates through our institutions. I think that's all I wanted to say. And, you know, a lot of this work is really about getting community feedback. And so we really use this stuff to be able to guide our program. And I'll say that, you know, collaboration, solidarity with other groups, but also other communities of color. Like I have a really good relationship with the Carver. You know, we talk about these things as ways of community building, and that's kind of the direction that we want to go. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sona. So next up, we have Vivian Dr Trung. So we will go to her and meet myself there.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you, Valbir, for bringing us all together. So I'm Vivian Trung. I teach Asian American Studies at Vassar College, and my research focuses on histories of Asian American coalition building with other communities of color in movements against police violence. And just to give a brief content warning, I will be describing cases of police and gender-based violence in my comments. So to give a sense of where I'm coming from, one of the central cases that I focus on in my research is the case of 16-year-old Chinese American Yongshin Huang. So this occurred in 1995 when Yongshin Huang was playing in his friend's backyard with a BB gun in Brooklyn, and one of the neighbors called the police, and when they arrived, they shot Yongshin Huang in the back of the head. And even though I was too young to really understand what was happening at the time, this occurred a couple of blocks away from my childhood home. So I grew up in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. And as I got older, I realized that these are not really stories that are being told about Asian Americans in terms of Asian Americans' vulnerability to police and state-sanctioned violence. So I didn't really get involved in political work or really had a way to really talk about race until I started taking ethnic studies classes in college. And that's when I got involved in a community organization called the Providence Youth Student Movement in Rhode Island. And they organize Southeast Asian youth against police violence and racial profiling, particularly Cambodian and Hmong youth who are being profiled as gang members. So after I graduated, I came back to New York City and started working as a youth organizer with CAAAV Organizing Asian Communities, which was formerly known as the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence. And at the time, it was the Bloomberg era, and we were organizing against stop and frisk and conducting Know Your Rights trainings for people to understand what to do when they encounter the police. And we were pushing a set of bills through City Council for police accountability. So that's just to give a sense of where I'm coming from. But the main thing I wanted to focus on today is thinking about our current moment and this inundation of cases of anti-Asian violence, and this question of how do we respond to this violence as Asian Americans? So for city governments from New York to Oakland, it's looked like more policing. So in New York City in particular, the NYPD in August of last year created an Asian hate crime task force. And in Oakland, in February, after the attacks on Asian elders in the Bay Area, the mayor actually blamed the movement to defund the police for those incidents. So there's this way that these cases of anti-Asian violence are being used to build up policing and to delegitimize the movement for Black lives. So one narrative that has emerged in this moment is that Asian Americans shouldn't call for more policing because it increases violence against Black and Latinx people. And one thing that I wanted to address today is that that implies that the interests of Asian Americans and the interests of other communities of color are in conflict, when in reality, the police haven't really protected Asian Americans either. So, the most obvious recent example of this is after the Atlanta shootings. I'm sure many of us at least watched part of that awful press conference in which Captain Jay Baker of Georgia's Cherokee County said of the shooter in that case, yesterday was a really bad day for him and this is what he did. So a way of kind of dismissing this really horrific act of violence. And of course, it was later discovered that that police officer had posted on Facebook these racist t-shirts that attributed, that said something like coronavirus imported from China, right? So what I want us to address is that this is not just one bad cop or one exceptional statement. And then if we look, so I'm going to talk about the New York City context since this is the one that I'm most familiar with. But if we look at New York City, the same people who have been most vulnerable to anti-Asian violence, the cases that we're seeing now, including elders and massage parlor workers, those same people have been most vulnerable to violence from the police. So there have been several cases of Asian, specifically Chinese elders who have been beaten by the police. So in 2012, there was a case in Columbus Park in New York City's Chinatown in which a musician who only wanted to identify himself as Mr. Wu was playing traditional Chinese music with an ensemble that's usually, in the park, mostly made up of elders who are kind of like sharing this public space. A neighbor or resident or someone in the neighborhood ended up complaining about how loud the music was and called the police on these elders who were playing music in the park. And the NYPD ended up bloodying Mr. Wu and pinning him to the ground. So this was one case that happened in 2012. In 2014, an 84-year-old Kang Wong, who's also a Chinese elder, was stopped for jaywalking in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And he was also pinned to the ground by the police because he was being ticketed. He didn't speak English and tried to walk away from that interaction because he didn't really know what was going on. And then the police ended up also bloodying him. So in terms of massage parlor workers. In 2017, there was a prominent case of a massage parlor worker in Flushing, Queens. This massage parlor worker was named Yang Song, and she was chased to her death during a raid by the NYPD. And her family had actually reported that Yang Song had told them that the police had sexually assaulted her and pressured her into becoming an informant. So this case actually led to the founding of Red Canary Song, which is an organization that has really emerged at the forefront after the Atlanta shootings, advocating for the rights and dignity of sex workers and all massage parlor workers, whether they were involved in sex work or not. So these are just individual cases that have happened to Chinese Americans in New York City. And this is not to mention all of the arrests and deportations of Southeast Asians, the surveillance of Muslim and South Asian communities after 9/11. So, what does it mean to call the police to protect people that they weren't protecting in the first place? So I wanted to end with some questions because I'm still also working through, some of these questions myself. So with these cases showing how the police haven't served Asian Americans and in many cases have actually actively committed harm, where does that leave us? So what do we do with all of this kind of outpouring of grief and pain? And what exactly is it that we want as Asian Americans? And who or what creates safety? So one exercise that, especially abolitionist organizers have done is to, if we close our eyes and imagine what a safe and healthy and thriving community looks like, feels like, and sounds like, who or what is part of that vision. And when I've done that before, I imagine things like lots of green space for children to play in. I imagine people having access to housing and healthcare. I imagine, well-maintained streets and, elders being able to kind of like shop for vegetables and fruit and peace, right? And what's not part of that vision is like a huge police presence, right? So I think what I wanted to end with is just this idea that going back to what Sona said about urgency, that safety isn't something that we can necessarily just materialize with quick fixes. So if we push for these knee-jerk solutions, we end up with more policing and more punishment. So that might temporarily feel like justice, but it might actually just be vengeance. So do the solutions that we're pushing for actually get us closer to what a safe society would look and feel like? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivian. That's very super rich in terms of especially the questions you're sort of prompting us. And I'd love for folks to, I know we've gotten one question, but I'd love for folks to start even using the Q&A or chat space to respond to that or to ask further questions. So I wanted to turn now to Adrian for the next, as the next panelist. Thank you again, Vivian. So, Adrian.
Thanks so much, Valbir, for bringing us all together and for the previous speakers. I'm taking down notes as we go. So my name, again, is Adrian Bonifacio. I am the national chairperson of an organization called Anakhbayan USA, which is a grassroots organization of Filipino youth and students in diaspora. We have our mother chapter in the Philippines and then chapters across the US and then in different countries as well. I wish I found like a baby photo too, like in Sona's presentation, but I really resonated with that story because just thinking about how I was politicized and organized, I think a lot of my early experience, and I'm sure many of the folks here on this call can relate, right, with this kind of like cultural crisis that we come around, right? I was born and raised in Chicago. I went to a predominantly white Catholic middle school all the way up to elementary and middle school. And it was just confusing. There's this cultural crisis that comes with being part of diaspora in the United States, and especially in a country that is the colonizer of your homeland, right? Where there's intentional erasure, intentional, not even just erasure, but misinformation, active misinformation, right? So there's all these conflicting messages of, work hard, American dream, all those kinds of things, right? When in the day-to-day of my experience, just seeing my parents struggle, experiencing being part of a single parent household and just seeing the challenges with that, right? And so it was only later, similar to other folks, getting more politicized in college, being around folks who were part of community organizations, being exposed to different progressive ideas, that I was able to put that experience into context, right? That crisis in our cultural identities, right, is linked to so many other crises that impact our lives, right? In Anakhbayan in particular, we learn about and talk about systemic issues. What are the systemic issues facing the Filipino community in the Philippines and also in its diaspora, right? Issues like continued influence of countries like the United States, right? In a form of power that we call imperialism, right? That despite the United States formally, quote unquote, granting independence, it's weird to even say that you grant someone else independence, that there's so much influence that's still there in the country. So there's imperialism, there's continued vast exploitation of farmers, agricultural workers in the Philippines that leads to forced migration, that leads to forced migration outside the Philippines as well. And then, of course, just how government officials, those in power, continue to profit within their positions, right? So there's all these systemic things that are happening that have impacts on not just people in the Philippines, but its diaspora too, because those are the very conditions that force families like my own to migrate. And it's not just a historical phenomena of these different waves of migration. It's something that's happening today, right? Where every day over 6,000 Filipinos are leaving the country in search of better work abroad, right? That's every day, right? And so when I talk about the impacts of all these things, right? It's not just impacts, but we're also talking about violence, right? The current moment we're in has a lot about anti-Asian violence. And so I also like Sona and like Vivian, I want to expand what our definition of violence might look like, right? So it's not just these things that happen to us, that kind of cultural crisis I was talking about before, but definitely economically, politically, and so on. What does it mean that for so many of us, we are living in immigrant families up against neoliberal economic policies, right? That are privatizing our healthcare, that are making things unaffordable for us, privatizing our education. I don't know how many of y'all have had tuition increases in the last couple of years, despite being in pandemic conditions, right? I know that's a huge issue in the Bay Area where I live right now. Just different ways that forced migration, like I mentioned, continues to exist. In terms of political crisis and political violence, the anti-Asian violence that we're seeing at the hands of, white supremacists, or just white supremacy as a system as a whole, is just really the tip of the iceberg, right? We have a lot of the state violence that Vivian was talking about just earlier, right? And so for us in Anakhbayan, we really see that the white supremacy, the violence against Asians here in the United States are stemming from these really systemic problems, right? Namely, how do systems of power try to monopolize our lives in so many different ways, right? And so that's really the frame I would like to discuss the current moment in, and also frame what our chapters have been doing to respond to the moment, right? Whether it's responding to the violence that is happening through very explicit means, right? Murder, physical assault attacks, or the more subversive economic and cultural violence that our communities face too. And so, we are, after the shootings happened, a lot of our chapters responded on the ground in solidarity with other community organizations who are also mobilizing around the issue, right? They were always careful to also frame it in the broader context of white supremacist violence, right? And state violence in particular, right? Because in many ways, state violence is, and when I say state violence, I mean through institutions like the police, the military, even in government agencies that you might think are quite civilian, like Department of Housing, for example, right? There are ways that there's violence that's perpetuated through different policies that enacts, right? Department of Education, right? We know that the previous Secretary of Education under Trump, Betsy DeVos, was a huge person that just gutted millions of students' rights to education around the country, right? And so that's what I mean by state violence, right? I mentioned that because in many ways, state violence is the one that paves the way for other white folks and even people of color to commit crimes against other people of color, other oppressed folks, right? And that's because it's upholding this system that keeps white supremacy in power, right? And so one recent example, just to uplift other cases of how state violence directly impacts Asian American communities, is the campaign for justice for Angelo Quinto. Angelo Quinto was a 30-year-old Filipino man who was murdered by Antioch police. Antioch is a city in the East Bay, in the Bay Area. The police, Angelo was having a mental health episode. His family was trying to figure out what to do. They called folks, but before the mental health responders came, the police came first. And they used the same knee-to-neck restraint that killed George Floyd in Minneapolis. And so our own members in the Bay Area have joined many other amazing organizations in supporting the family, driving forward the campaign and making clear that the answer to stopping anti-Asian violence is not in more policing, because it's very clear that the police was the one perpetuating the violence in our communities, right? And that's through murder, imprisonment, and the many other examples that Vivian also mentioned earlier. And so, even in the recent the Stop Asian Hate mobilizations that have been happening in the Bay Area, the Quinto family has been front and center, sharing their story and telling folks that policing won't keep us safe, right? In Washington, D.C., our chapter also mobilized with other organizations in coalition to discuss how different communities, unite against white supremacy, including the various agencies that perpetuate it, like the various D.C. police forces. There are so many police agencies that operate in Washington, D.C. alone, and a lot of them are responsible for a lot of violence against our communities. But like many folks have been saying now, the fight against violence in the API community is not just one that's insular to ourselves, but one that we share with our Black, Indigenous, queer and trans, all oppressed communities under white supremacy and under imperialism. Anakhbayan USA is a part of a national alliance, which is called the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which is originally founded in the 70s after successful movements to free Angela Davis and other political prisoners at the time. And so currently it's fighting, against police murder, police torture, other crimes, and demanding that power be put back in the hands of the people, right? There's a lot of campaigns around the country calling for community control of the police so that the power to do things like defunding, to abolish the oppressive institutions that are used against us, those decisions are put in the hands of the people, right? And not left up to elected officials who may or may not go back on their word because of vested interests elsewhere, right? But to also talk about violence against Asians and white supremacy, for us, we never want to stop within the borders of the US either, right? In many ways, the violence perpetrated against our communities here has much deeper roots in the history of militarism abroad, violence in our homelands, that continues to this day, and that has actually been the cause of a lot of outmigration, right? Because of political instability that is caused when the US military intervenes places, right? In the Philippines, one of the most recent infamous cases was the murder of Jennifer Laude, who was a trans woman killed by US Marine Joseph Scott Pemberton in 2014, who was recently actually given full pardon by the Duterte government, which is like a whole other story about what's happening in the Philippines. Yeah, there's so many other examples. You know, in the month of March alone, there were massacres in the Philippines, 10 brutal murders of peasant, labor, human rights activists in just one region alone, and many more victims of mass raids, arrests that are targeting folks who are trying to build a movement against structural violence, right? And you know, these attacks by the Philippine police and military are in part actually funded through our own tax dollars, via military aid, via arms sales that are subsidized by our tax dollars, right? And you know, it's similar to how our tax money is going towards funding killer cops in police departments locally, and also through aid to other oppressive states like the state of Israel, right? That's oppressing Palestinian people every day. And so, you know, for us and for a lot of the allies we've been working with, to address anti-Asian violence really means addressing violence against all oppressed communities. And through that, fighting against militarism and war at home and abroad, right? Whether that's the policing in our communities, whether that's the kind of vigilante violence that's happening around the country, whether that's the military aid and massacres happening in the Philippines, ending Biden's current fuel blockade against Yemen, ending AFRICOM's militarization on the African continent, so on and so forth, right? And so in terms of our vision of justice, you know, what do we see as the way out, right? You know, there's so many different ways we could say it, but I think to put it simply, it's really just self-determination, right? How are we able to decide for ourselves as exploited and oppressed communities, how to keep ourselves safe, right? How to see, you know, our elders shopping for vegetables in the market, how to see resource centers that are fully funded and actually competent to serve the needs of our communities, right? The ability to ensure livelihood and basic rights for everyone, right? In Anakhbayan and what we were part of called the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines, it means genuine independence from imperialism. It means rights for the majority of people who have been denied them for so long, and especially the right to land, right? And so the only way that we can fight to be self-determining is if we have power, you know, just to reference some of the words that Balbir was quoting in the beginning of the presentation, right? That's really where mass movement building, bringing together community organizations, grassroots efforts, and building strong solidarity and unity among us all comes in, right? I really encourage everyone here, if you haven't, if you're not part of an organization, to join one. And if you don't have one that you like, then to build one that you like, and then come together, right? You know, when I started in Anakhbayan, we were just like, we didn't know what we were doing when we were building one of the chapters, but we made it work. And, you know, I think the community is stronger for it too, right? As we're able to make links with other community organizations that exist, right? You know, if there's anything history has taught us, it's that just mobilizing doesn't necessarily build our power, right? What we need is to get organized and organize others, right? I would say that actually, you know, the state, the police, other folks do have a lot of power in our current system, right? And they have power because they have organization, right? They have organization through police, they have organization through militarized forces across the world, they have organization through the different types of government institutions that are perpetuating things like housing discrimination or you know, ICE is an organization, right? And so for us to be self-determining, for us to have power, we need to build our own organizations, right? And we need to build our own organized strength based on building, you know, that genuine solidarity, anti-imperialist solidarity, to defend ourselves and also ultimately fight back. So that's where I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adrian. That was very sort of rich, and I really appreciate the way that everyone's been really nicely building off of one another and just sort of expanding the conversation too to thinking about transnational and anti-imperial organizing. So we have one more speaker, Jessica Nguyen, who will be sharing a bit of her own organizing experience at Virginia Tech. So I also want to encourage some more questions so that following Jessica's points, we are able to sort of have a bit of a conversation. So I'll turn it over now to Jessica.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Can everyone hear me? Great. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Firstly, I just want to thank Dr. Singh for having me here. It is an honor to be on this panel alongside such brilliant panelists who have been organizing and who are well versed in this. Also, special thanks to the Asian Cultural Engagement Center for helping facilitate, especially Dr. Nina Ha. But yeah, I'm going to try to be concise because I know we want to have time at the end for folks to ask questions. But yeah, I will be sharing my perspective as a student organizer at Virginia Tech. My name is Jessica Nguyen. I'm a student activist studying economics, Asian studies, and PPE, which is philosophy, politics, and economics. I organize on an institutional level. So in terms of organizing within the university, locally, and on a national level. Here is a photo of me and my friend Luna at a candlelight vigil that was hosted by the Coalition for Justice in Blacksburg. So in terms of my institutional organizing, I put postmodern organizing because I think organizing is different within an institution than outside of it. I currently serve as the president on the Asian American Student Union Executive Board at Virginia Tech. Our responsibility is to represent the entire Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, so APIDA community here, which is about 10% of the student population. So what that entails is representing the opinions and just bringing up problems that are relevant to our population to an administrative level. As president, I have a seat on this commission called the Commission on Student Affairs, and in it are the other big student leaders who represent large racial minority populations and minority populations as well, along with administration and faculty. And I will now provide a brief timeline of kind of like APIDA activism here. So in 2017, the Asian Cultural Engagement Center was open, and to my knowledge, I wasn't on the board in 2017, but at this time we didn't have an advisor. So it was kind of hard for us to mobilize and support the APIDA population to the best of our ability. But in 2019, Dr. Nina Ha joined VT as the director of the Asian Cultural Engagement Center, and I joined the Asian American Student Union as the vice president internal. I just want to say that at this point, I didn't have a very extensive background in Asian American studies. Of course, like it wasn't taught that much in public school for me. So I wasn't very familiar with the history. I just knew that it was something I cared about. I knew it was part of my identity and I wanted to get involved. But I had to sort of grow into my role when I joined AASU as vice president and learn very quickly what needed to be done. There were a lot of gaps. The university wasn't serving the APIDA population as well as it could be. And I think my experience with just talking with our constituency, which by the way, AASU serves as an umbrella organization of all the APIDA student orgs, and under us are 15 constituent organizations. So my role as VPI was to communicate with the presidents of these organizations and sort of hear their opinions and get a gauge on what needed to be done or how we could support the community collectively. So yeah, now I'm currently the president, still growing into my role, still not an expert on all of this, but I do care about the community a lot. So of course, once we found out, or once the surge in anti-Asian violence started garnering national attention, we took it as an opportunity to bring it up to the university as something that needed to be addressed, because there were also bias incidents on our campus with anti-Asian sentiments. So in February, this was at the end of February, I introduced a motion to the Commission on Student Affairs to support the APIDA community. I'm not going to go too much into detail about it, but the timing was really good because I brought this up before the Atlanta massacre, and bringing it up before then and then having that happen, I think helped bolster our point that this is a real problem. It needs to be addressed. But yeah, that is how I organize at an institutional level. Nationally, I recently joined this coalition called the Intercollegiate APIDA Coalition. And by recently, I mean like literally at the beginning of March. It was created by university students across the nation to address the surge in anti-Asian violence. And sort of our main goals were to release a joint statement together that we felt like was representative of what we all felt. It was a very long process, but we got it done. We facilitated an informational speaker panel with notable APIDA organizers. And lastly, we have an ongoing fundraiser to raise $20,000 for Asian Americans advancing justice. Here you can just see some of the students from different schools that have signed on. This isn't necessarily representative of like the schools that have signed on, but rather APIDA student leaders that organize for the APIDA population at these schools. So what I did for for ICAC was I was on the speaker panel team. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. Some of the people that we had on this panel, the first person we had was Benny Lo, and he's the founder of NextShark, which is the largest media outlet for Asian American news. Secondly, we had Tammy Cho, who's the co-founder of the Hate is a Virus campaign. Then we had Dr. Melissa Borja, who is an assistant professor in American culture at the University of Michigan. And lastly, we had Carl Chan, who's the president of the Oakland Chinatown Chamber of Commerce. It was a very authentic dialogue. The team and I got together before to talk about like the kinds of questions that we wanted to ask them. I helped co-moderate this event with my friend Rena, who is on the Asian American Student Association at Vanderbilt University. Yeah, we just took opinions from like people within our coalition of what they think needed to be addressed. And we were able to host this event, which was really great because we all got this together in less than a month. But yeah, more about my national organizing. I went to Nashville recently to organize with the folks on the Asian American Student Association at Vanderbilt. And that was when like we were kind of fleshing out the questions we wanted for the panel. And I also traveled to Atlanta briefly to attend rallies and organize with students there. So from a student perspective, we have identified a few issues. These are like the most pressing ones to us from our perspective, from the scope of organizing that we do. So the first issue is has to do with the lack of education about Asian American history. And what this entails is, so of course, many of us grow up in predominantly white environments where the history focuses from the perspective of whiteness, from all that. And so we experience cultural loss as a result of that. So how can we begin to deconstruct the compelling and collective desire of APIDAs to assimilate in this regard. And one of the solutions is advocating for a more encompassing educational experience. Reforming public schooling curriculums to include Asian American history is really important, but also the implementation of Asian American studies programs in higher education institutions is really important as well. The second point that we identified is advocating for accessibility and improvement of mental health resources that can adequately address the specific needs of the Asian and the APIDA community. So not only hiring mental health professionals who can speak different languages and cater to the Asian international community, but mental health professionals who are familiar with the needs of the Asian American community. And lastly, hiring more Asian and APIDA faculty and staff, not purely just because we want to be represented or purely because they are of Asian descent, but because they have experience with Asian American studies. And that just goes back into the point that we need more people to talk about our history so it's known. But yep, that's all I have. I've put my email right there in case anyone wanted to get in contact with me or ask any questions. But yeah, thank you so much for having me and letting me talk about my organizing experience.
Thank you, Jessica. That was super rich, and it's so inspiring to see the work that you've been doing recently, but also just over the course of the last year. So it's really wonderful to have your perspective. There were some questions that were answered earlier, I know, but I want to sort of open it up to have other folks talk a bit about even just responding to Vivian's sort of prompt of thinking about how we can imagine what communities can look like, right? If we think about it in the sort of most maybe ideal or expansive or not necessarily just simply inclusive, but really thinking about it as something that is transformative in terms of our own relationships with power. Because I think what all of the speakers have done is really speak to the kinds of collective empowerment that the sort of APIDA and Asian American community has been doing for a very, very long time, right? And sort of acknowledging the history of that organizing, acknowledging the work that's been happening for generations, and obviously it coming to a head most recently, but really thinking about what that might mean. So we have a bunch of answered questions. So I think this is great in terms of really thinking too, about like the way that we're understanding state violence, the way that sort of Adrian, Vivian especially spoke to that, and really thinking against the kinds of like policing and harassment that have occurred, especially with some of the really specific examples Vivian brought in, and the case of Angelo Quinto that Adrian brought in. So I do want to sort of, even thinking about abolitionist possibilities, as sort of Vivian brought in, maybe I'll pose this question again that Vivian posed of like, how can we imagine a sort of a more collectively and expansive and imaginatively a better future for Asians and other communities of color? How do we figure that? And Vivian provided some really nice examples, but were there things folks might want to add to that?
I can say something. I've been thinking about the same, and I think a lot of us have been. And again, I think as my role as like a city employee, right, which is very different in the sense of like, there's policies and all these sort of things. But one of the things that I'll say in Austin, and I'm not as involved with this, but I've been watching this as an Austinite. We have this whole reimagined public safety, task force that's been going on. I really highly recommend watching Wednesday nights. It's all been like live streamed, and which is really amazing in that sense of the transparency around it. But watching it, you can see the sort of conflicts, right? In the sense of like, you know, the bureaucracy of things. And so, but I've participated. So this process has been like a 7-month process, and it's with the Equity Office and several other stakeholders, where they brought in community organizations too that, you know, are looking at communities here in Austin that have been harmed by policing, right? And it's been fascinating, again, like just to kind of watch how this plays out, right? Because I do think that, you know, when we have these institutions, we haven't really envisioned, right, these broader ways of thinking about this. And so personally, for me, I participated the Indian American, I forget what their group name is, but it's like Indian Americans of Central Texas or something, organized one of these sessions where they were trying to get feedback from different community members. And I participated in it. And I was honestly very surprised at like the older Indian aunties and uncles, like kind of starting to see, right? Like what policing, like how it may be different for the Black community or for the Latinx community. And so there were like a series of questions of sort of, you know, would you call the police in this situation? And if not, what would you do, right? And so, you know, we, in a small group, we kind of shared these thoughts. And so it's been, I'm not saying that this is like all easy and that this is, you know, moving, because I also went to an APD town hall last week that was specifically for Asian Americans, that it was a bit difficult to watch that. And I think similar to what Vivian was saying was, you know, it's always about like these hate crimes or ways of where we're adding more policing for safety. But I'm seeing a change, at least. I've lived in Austin for a long time, and I'm seeing a change in the sort of conversations, especially with some of the Asian Americans that would tend to really, you know, be satisfied with being a model minority, right? And in these ways. And so, yeah, I'll just put that out there. I don't know, you know, I think more conversations, and especially like intergenerational in that sense, and with these communities to really understand policing history, because many of those, you know, folks haven't understood that, right?
And I'll just say one thing also about this idea of like reimagining what safety looks like too. So I think, so there's a question about like resources, and like one of the interviews that I listened to recently that really moved me was there's a podcast called Time to Say Goodbye, and they interviewed a scholar, Naomi Murakawa, and she was talking about how, you know, policing and prisons have really, you know, shaped the way that we think. And one of the things that I was thinking about too, in terms of like the Kang Wong case, in which the elderly Chinese American man was brutalized for jaywalking, was, you know, that the police were a presence where he was at that moment, because there had been a series of accidents, like pedestrians, you know, getting hurt and killed in that area. And, you know, we've gotten to that point where it's, you know, everyone jaywalks in New York City, right? So if you've been to the city, it's just like, that's a normal thing, right? So why was the immediate response to just ticket people who jaywalked, instead of like thinking about like, what are the conditions that create danger for people who are walking around in the city, right? So it's, you know, there's ways that like policing is just like the easiest thing that people can kind of like reach for. And I think, you know, it has really kind of limited what we can imagine as, you know, safety or well-being. And the other thing I'll say too is that I think this is, it might not feel like it, but I think it can also be a hopeful moment, because I'm a historian and I study the history of movements against police violence, and even some of the more radical organizations and the second half of the 20th century weren't really like explicitly, the ones that I'm looking at least, weren't really explicitly naming defunding the police and abolition as a goal. And last year's protests have really pushed that conversation forward. So I think we're at a crossroads where we're really kind of deciding, like, what do we do with all of this energy, and how can we make it so we're not just like limited to these solutions that have been like provided to us over the decades.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Sona and Vivian, for those responses. There are a couple more questions that came up, and I'm going to pose a couple of them. And then, I mean, one is about resources. So Vivian, you sort of spoke to that, but my intention for the teach-in was to come in with a number of resources that I would have posted. But what I was thinking is that we can sort of have that circulate once this is the recording link is sent out to folks that attended. As probably all of the people on the panel and many of you listening in are aware, there's been a lot of these types of sort of conversations, teach-ins, community check-ins. And so there's a host of resources that I'm going to sort of collect in terms of sort of sharing that. So if you registered, you will get that sort of link to probably what it will be a shared Google Doc. But an anonymous attendee asked this question, which I would love to sort of hear some of your responses to. If you had to pick just one policy, right, if we're thinking in terms of policies, but maybe we can think even more expansively, right, to implement to address the issues we've talked about today, what would it be? So, I mean, you guys spoke to so many different sort of particular kinds of sets of politics. So maybe we can, sort of focus on this one to answer.
I can go first. So I think that the best course of action, in my perspective as a student, is the implementation or mandating the incorporation of Asian American history into public schooling curriculums like K through 12, because year after year we learn about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War. There's so much space to incorporate Asian American history, but it's just not something that has been incorporated. And I think if folks were to learn more about it, they could be able to resonate with our experiences better.
Yeah, I can go next. It's hard. So many policies I'd like to pass. But I think one is just going back to the question of like organized power, right? A lot of our chapters have been working alongside the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression to push campaigns for community control, whether that's of the police or of other institutions in the government, which I know, there's ongoing conversation and communication within kind of like the community control, defund, abolition realm. And, the one thing that we are always like wary of is, in many cases after when the uprisings and rebellions happened last year after the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, there were all these politicians who were saying that, oh, I'm going to defund the police. And then, lo and behold, it just goes to school resource officers. Or I'm going to abolish the department. And then lo and behold, it just puts it up for a referendum that keeps the police anyway. So the idea of community control, just to keep it short, is how do we create organized power in a way that gives the people on the ground, right, and not necessarily like people who are like elected as mayor or city council members, the ability to decide how we're going to defund the police or how we're going to abolish like oppressive institutions. So can definitely send some literature on that kind of conversation going between like community control, defunding, and abolition too.
Yeah, I will just add too, I think, this conversation around, especially Adrian, what you were talking about in terms of like, just the idea of everyone joining an organization, right, and becoming part of an organizing community. I think that's something that in terms of building people power is really, really important, right? Knowing that we ourselves as individuals have the capacity to do that work with others and really think about our own sort of commitments beyond just sort of like the ways that we are, especially under like these present conditions, sort of contained to really individualized spaces, right? So, and I think Jessica, your point too about bringing ethnic studies, bringing Asian American studies, and bring that history to bear for K through 12, right? Where, you know, in places like California, that's something that was passed, but even the implementation of that has been so difficult. And not only at K through 12, but even the way that having those types of courses, even at the university level, has been really hard to implement. I want to just close just for time. I really want to thank each of our panelists. I want to also thank those that asked some really wonderful questions. And I really appreciate Sona, Vivian, Adrian, Jessica, Dr. Ha, as well as Fatima for sort of really helping bring this all together. This has been a really important sort of moment in which to respond and to use the urgency that a lot of other folks are feeling in response to what's happened and what's been happening to Asians in the APIDA community. And I just want to thank you all. We will have a recording of this that I will circulate, or the ACE Center or whomever will circulate, and I will compile a set of resources for folks to share. So that, you know, I think there's a lot of that has been circulating, but I will try to sort of organize it and things that were sort of relevant to the conversation that we had. And I will sort of say thank you again to everybody, and we'll close out, and I will end the meeting shortly, and I will say thank you again and take care, and we will be in touch with a set of resources and links of the recording for this teach-in. So again, thank you, Vivian, Sona, Adrian, Jessica, Dr. Ha, and Fatima, and I will see you all hopefully in sometime in the future. All right, take care, guys. Bye.
Thank you, Valvir.
Thank you.